Did you know Namibia was one of those rare cases of African countries which struggled to obtain independence from their very own African neighbors? One of the most fascinating countries on the African continent, Namibia is world famous for having the highest sand dunes in the world and most recently referred to as the Dubai of Africa. You might think that's already interesting enough. Well, it gets better. In this video, we'll be traveling back in time to unravel how Namibia gained its independence from South Africa in 1990. If you're new here, please do subscribe and click the notification bell for more informative videos from our channel. Officially recognized as the Republic of Namibia, Namibia is located in the southern part of Africa. Its western border is the Atlantic Ocean. Namibia shares land borders with Zambia and Angola to the north, Botswana to the east, and its former trustee patron South Africa to the south and east. Namibia is quite a small country having a population of about 2.5 million, with a gross domestic product of $10.7 billion, and its capital and largest city is Windhoek. It is a member state of the United Nations, the Southern African Development Community, the African Union, and the Commonwealth of Nations. On the 21st of March 1990, Namibia gained its independence from South Africa, but that was only possible at the cost of the Namibian War of Independence. To understand how the country got its independence from South Africa in the first place, let's do some time travel back to the colonial era. Back in 1884, Namibia was more referred to as German Southwest Africa, as it was a German territory which was placed under the South African administration by the League of Nations after the First World War. The Germans, who usually administered their colonies by introducing minimal levels of economic and administrative establishments, developed farming and infrastructure. Things seemed to go on well in German Southwest Africa until 1904, when a genocide against the Hero and Nama people of the country was ignited and lasted for good 4 years. The reason for the genocide was unclear at first, but soon later became obvious that each of these ethnic groups was battling for German favors and the right to rule the other clans. At the time, South Africa, which was the next-door neighbor in the east, decided to intervene in the situation, joining forces with anti-German Southwest African tribes to resist and push out the colonial master Germany. Thus, in 1915, German rule ended with a defeat by South African forces. In 1920, after the end of World War I, the League of Nations recognized the defeat of Germany, now mandated administration of the colony to South Africa. So initially South Africa meant to simply intervene and help Namibia get independence, but in the end, underlining concealed intentions surfaced. South Africa was now a mandatory power, and as such, it imposed its laws, including racial classifications and rules. From 1948, with the National Party elected to power, this included South Africa applying apartheid to what was then known as Southwest Africa. Later on, after the Second World War, the League of Nations was dissolved, and then emerged the United Nations. When the latter was established, the South African Prime Minister, General Smuts, argued for the total incorporation of Southwest Africa into South Africa as one of its provinces. Now, this was asking for a little too much, and as such the request was turned down by the UN. However, it was just a matter of time before South Africa had its way. The apartheid rules which South Africa applied on Namibia led to some really serious human rights violations which occurred at the hands of South African Defence Force, SAF, soldiers. In fact, one such incident was the Kasinga massacre at a Namibian refugee camp in Angola on 4th May 1978. In the later 20th century, Namibian nationals began causing uprisings and making demands for political representation by native African political activists seeking independence. This resulted in the UN assuming direct responsibility over the territory in 1966, although South Africa still maintained de facto rule. After many conflicts and then negotiations, in 1973 the UN recognized the Southwest Africa People's Organization, SWAPO, as the official representative of the Namibian people. The party was largely dominated by the Ovambo, who are a large plurality in the territory. As SWAPO's insurgency intensified, indigenes fled the country to neighboring states, and some were internally displaced. Meanwhile, South Africa's case for annexation in the international community continued to decline. The UN had gathered sufficient evidence to declare that South Africa had failed in its obligations to ensure the moral and material well-being of Southwest Africa's indigenous inhabitants, and had thus disavowed its own mandate. On 12 June 1968, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution proclaiming that, in accordance with the desires of its people, Southwest Africa be renamed Namibia. Also, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 269, adopted in August 1969, declared South Africa's continued occupation of Namibia illegal. As such, in recognition of this landmark decision, SWAPO's frontline wing was renamed the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, PLAN. With the PLAN involved in heavy insurgency attacks against South Africa, they turned to the Soviet Union, Angola, and Cuba for patronage, and the latter were generous, increasing their support and deploying advisors to train the PLAN insurgents directly, as well as supplying more weapons and ammunition. SWAPO's leadership, dependent on Soviet, Angolan, and Cuban military aid, positioned the movement firmly within the socialist bloc by 1975. This practical alliance reinforced the prevailing perspective of SWAPO as a Soviet proxy, which dominated the Cold War ideology in South Africa and the United States. Based on interest, however, the Soviet Union supported SWAPO partly because it viewed South Africa as a regional Western ally. Still, that all played out to the PLAN's advantage, who were growing tired of South African peacekeeping forces still patrolling their capital city and administrative headquarters. The Soviet Union and UN began mounting pressure on South Africa such that they accepted Namibian independence, but in exchange for Cuban military withdrawal from the region and an Angolan commitment to cease all aid to PLAN. Then later, PLAN and South Africa adopted an informal ceasefire in August 1988, and a United Nations Transition Assistance Group, UNTAG, was formed to monitor the Namibian peace process and supervise the return of refugees. Following continued guerrilla warfare against the South African administration in Namibia, South Africa installed an interim administration in Namibia in 1985 to prepare for transit. Namibia obtained full independence from South Africa on 21 March 1990. By the end of the transition period, the last South African troops had been withdrawn from Namibia, all political prisoners being granted amnesty, racially discriminatory legislation repealed, and 42,000 Namibian refugees returned to their homes. However, Walvis Bay and the Penguin Islands remained under South African control until 1994. In February of the same year, independence was granted, and the Namibian constitution was adopted. It incorporated protection for human rights and compensation for state expropriations of private property, and established an independent judiciary, legislature, and executive presidency. Sam Nujoma was sworn in as the first president of Namibia at a ceremony attended by Nelson Mandela of South Africa, who had been released from prison the previous month, and representatives from 147 countries, including 20 heads of state. In 1994, following the first multiracial elections in South Africa, Walvis Bay was seceded to Namibia. So then, we come to the end of this video, how Namibia gained independence from South Africa in 1990. They struggled hard, just like many other African countries, to obtain their emancipation. But just as the Namibian proverb goes, from little date seeds, great things are born. Thanks for watching. Please be sure to subscribe if you haven't done so and click on the notification icon in other not to miss out on our subsequent videos.